Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. I finally got my review units in from Anbernic for the RG34XXSP, so today we're going to do a review. And I've got good news and bad news about this handheld. The good news is that I think it's almost perfect when it comes to Game Boy Advance. It is almost identical in size to the original Game Boy Advance SP and feels very similar to it as well, with the D-pad and face buttons that are a little bit clickier but very close. I really love the screen on this as well. It is a 3x integer scale of the original Game Boy Advance. It's also super bright and vibrant, and so it's one of the better screens that you can have when it comes to playing GBA. Now the bad news is that I think that some of the design choices are weird on this. We'll talk about that throughout this review, and then also it's not that great when it comes to playing systems besides Game Boy Advance, just because this screen can get a little bit small when showing 4x3 content. And so before we even start the review, here's my big takeaway. If you are looking for a Game Boy Advance style handheld that is clamshell in form factor, I think this is the best handheld for GBA in particular. It's only $60. I think that it is well worth it, especially if you compare it against like a modded original GBA. But I think if you're looking for a more well-rounded handheld that you can play with a variety of systems, there are better clamshell options out there. Let's jump into the details and go ahead and get started. Okay, a couple weeks ago I did an impressions video already of this handheld, talked about, the way the buttons feel and how the screen looks and whatnot, but there's one clarification that I'd like to make. In that video I shared my findings from another channel called The Fox, a good friend of mine, and he had been messing around with the software inside and it had been reporting that it was a 4x3 display. And in my own impressions video I was thinking the same thing, because when you pull off the casing around the screen, it's actually a 4x3 aspect ratio. And so the idea at the time was that maybe it was actually 4x3, but they were turning off some of the pixels to force it into 3x2. Now since then, Anbernic has clarified that it is indeed a 3x2 aspect ratio screen, but the housing itself is 4x3. Same thing on the original 34XX handheld. They both have 4x3 housings, but the screen is 3x2. And so I did want to clarify that yes, this is indeed a 3x2 aspect ratio screen. There's no hidden pixels or anything else like that. It really is just the software that is outputting the wrong numbers. But at the end of the day, rest assured that this is a true 3x integer scale of Game Boy Advance, so everything is going to balance correctly. Now in that impressions video, I also went over the specs of the handheld itself. I'll leave it all linked down below, but in a nutshell, this is a clamshell handheld that has a 3x2 aspect ratio screen that is 3.4 inches in size and has a resolution of 720 by 480. The processor inside is also the H700, so the same thing we've seen with the other XX devices from Anbernic. This means you'll be able to reliably play systems all the way up through PlayStation 1 and a good chunk of other ones like Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and PSP. The only major difference about this handheld compared to the others is that it has 2 GB of RAM instead of 1. That's not going to make a huge difference when it comes to emulation, but when it comes to playing PC ports via tools like PortMaster, this should give you a little bit better performance. And like with the other XX devices, it's got a lot of good bells and whistles to it. It's got Bluetooth, it's got Wi-Fi, it also has HDMI out. We've also got a variety of color options for this model. There are 4 altogether, and I have 3 of them here to review. So the first one is yellow. This one is actually my favorite color among them. I like the fact that it has red buttons. It kind of gives me a Pikachu vibe. And then everything else has got gray or black accents to it. And so I like the fact that it just kind of stands out. It is really neat. So this is the one I've been playing the most. We've also got one called Indigo, which reminds me of a Game Boy Advance or maybe the Nintendo GameCube, and it has these colored ABXY buttons. The one model I don't have is the black model, and it looks very similar to this, but it's all black, including these buttons are going to be black, but it's going to have the same colored ABXY. And then finally, we've got this one, which they call the gray model. And so this one is modeled after the North American Super Nintendo. You can see with these purple buttons. This one is also pretty cool, nice and subdued. And so a lot like all of the other XX devices from Anbernic, it's a pretty good deal. I mean, this thing I think retails around $65, but you can often find it on sale. And that's a really good price for what you're getting here. Solid build quality, the ability to play a bunch of systems, thousands of games, but then also all the creature comforts that I like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and HDMI out. And so I think the big question becomes not really whether or not this is a good deal, because I think it is, much like with the other XX devices. It really comes to which one is going to be the best one for you in terms of those other options. And I'm going to make an assumption that you've got 2 things going on in your mind. Number one is that you're looking for a clamshell if you're looking at this video, and then also maybe you're looking for something that is Game Boy Advance specific. And so let's address both of those, and maybe that'll help steer you in the right direction. Let's start with a quick crash course in some of the clamshell options we have today. So number one is just going to be a regular old Game Boy Advance. This thing is an updated version, so it has a different shell on it and also has an IPS laminated screen. So this is an aftermarket Game Boy Advance, and it just plays cartridges, and it also requires me to use just a regular charger. And I think I picked this up for around $150, and of course it's a very nostalgic and authentic experience given the fact that it can play those cartridges. Now last year Anbernic came out with the RG35XXSP. So this one is similar to what we're reviewing today, but a little bit different in some ways. Number one, it has a 4:3 aspect ratio screen, 3.5 inches, and then also does not have analog sticks. Now, paradoxically, this one is a lot bigger than the one we're reviewing today. And even though the difference between this and a Game Boy Advance SP looks a little bit slight, it is actually a big difference when you're throwing it in your pocket. And so I've always found this one to be a little bit too chunky to be my primary handheld, even though it was one of my favorite handhelds of last year. And then now we also have this Anbernic RG34XXSP. So the big difference here is that this one now has analog sticks and then also a 3:2 aspect ratio screen that is 3.4 inches diagonally. This one is also smaller. It's actually almost identical in size to the GBA SP. It feels just the same when I'm throwing it in my pocket, so for me, I've just been thinking they are the exact same size. However, Anbernic is not the only game in town when it comes to making a clamshell. So there's this one right here called the Miyoo Flip. This one is also the exact same size as the 34XXSP and the Game Boy Advance SP, but this one actually looks strikingly similar to this one. Right off the bat, you can see it has two analog sticks, just like the one we're reviewing today, but it has a different screen. This one is like the original 35XXSP in that it is 4:3 and 3.5 inches. And so the Miyoo Flip is kind of like the love child between these two, even though it's obviously made by a different company. It's got the same kind of screen as the 35XXSP, but the same size and controls as the 34XXSP. And in a perfect world, this would be the perfect clamshell because it's got all the things that I like from each of these two different models, but the big problem here is that this hinge is kind of lousy. I made a whole video about it, I'll leave it linked down below if you haven't seen it, but the idea is that I don't think this one is worth recommending just because it is so prone to breaking here on the hinge. And so that's a quick crash course in some of the other options you have when it comes to a clamshell specifically. You can always get a modded GBA. It's going to cost a little bit more, but you will be able to play original cartridges. It feels very authentic. The Miyoo Flip should be an awesome handheld, but it is hard for me to recommend just because of the hinge issues that I've seen throughout the community. And so this is one that I think really still needs a revision. And so in terms of clamshells, I think it still does come down to these two options just because these are the two that I think are the most reliable, but they do serve different purposes. Now, in addition to wanting a clamshell handheld, let's also say that you want a Game Boy Advance handheld. So let's talk about it from a GBA perspective. And like I mentioned in the intro, I think this is amazing when it comes to Game Boy Advance for many reasons. Let's talk about the screen first. First of all, with a resolution of 720 by 480, this is a 3x integer scale of Game Boy Advance, so it's going to look super sharp and crisp. You can also apply things like LCD grid shaders, like I'm doing right here, to make it look a little bit chunkier too. And so this is just a really authentic experience when it comes to visualizing the Game Boy Advance. The display also gets nice and bright, so I'm going to press the menu button and volume up to show you the max brightness. You can see that it is blowing out the screen a little bit on my camera, which is a good sign. That means you will be able to play it outdoors. It also gets quite dim. If I press menu and then volume down, you can see just how low it gets. And so this will be great to play in the dark as well. So I think that visually, if you were looking for something very close to the original Game Boy Advance, there are very few handhelds that look this good. Another reason why I think this is really good for Game Boy Advance are the D-pad and face buttons because they are very similar to the GBA SP. I did a lot of testing about this in my impressions video, but these take a little bit more actuation force to press down, but they have that same clicky feel to them. So I think if you're looking for that same sort of like GBA SP feel, these are very, very close. It's also got shoulder and trigger buttons that I think are relatively decent, and then these analog sticks are a little bit divisive just because you know, many of the games that you're going to want to use analog sticks with are going to be 4:3 in aspect ratio, which we'll talk about later, but is not very great for the screen. And then the other paradox is that because this is a GBA style handheld, you're not going to really need analog sticks when playing Game Boy Advance games in the first place. So it is a little bit weird that the analog sticks are there, but the nice thing is that they don't really stick out from the shell at all. So when you're playing, it is very easy to ignore. It's just the fact that you can see them while playing, and whether or not that bothers you is really going to be up to you. Now, the third reason why I think this is a good Game Boy Advance handheld has to do with the form factor, the fact that it's a clamshell, which gives us a lot of options. Number one, a clamshell is self-protecting. That means that when it is closed up like this, it's going to be able to be thrown into a backpack. You don't have to worry about the screen getting damaged. It's also really nice and compact when closed up, so I like the fact that it's so travel friendly. But the other part to it is that if you open it up, it's actually pretty roomy as well. A lot roomier than you may think when you have it closed down. You think, oh, this thing is tiny. You open it up, you're like, oh yeah, this is actually pretty good. Another feature I love about this clamshell is that it has magnetic sensors up here in the lid, which means that as you're playing it, the software will know when you close it, which is going to put it to sleep or can shut it down depending on what you have in the settings, which is great. And so I think a clamshell form factor is great when it comes to grab and go. It's nice and compact, so it makes it travel friendly. You can then open it up and play some games, and then you can close it up again, and the magnetic sensor is going to know that you've closed it, and it's going to save your game and all that. And then finally, the other reason why I think this is a good Game Boy Advance handheld is that we have multiple software options. The chip that's in this handheld has been used in about 10 other handhelds previously, and all the software that's been made for them will work on this one too. So on the left here, we have the stock operating system. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but then also we have custom firmware options like this one called Newly. There's another one called MooOS as well. They are both very feature rich. And there are some really neat things that you can do with the software with any of these. For example, with Newly, I have it set up that as soon as I turn the device on, it just goes into my Game Boy Advance menu. And so I just treat this like a Game Boy Advance machine, and the fact that it just opens up to these games and then I can start playing them. And again, if I'm done playing them, I can just close the screen. It's actually going to shut the device down as well. So I really love that option too. Now this software is still in early testing, so it's not available for the public just yet, but it will be available at some point. And if you make a small donation to the team, they'll give you early access. That's how I have the option right here. I'll leave all that stuff linked down below. However, the stock operating system is still pretty good, and it'll get you by no problem. It's a very simple setup. So you go into the RA games section, and then you can find your games list from here. Let's go into Game Boy Advance, and you can see that these are all your games. You just launch them from here, and the device will come with a preloaded card, so it'll have most of your games on here. It is worth noting that things like Mario and Pokemon and even Sonic games are no longer loaded on their systems, and so you'll have to add those ROMs yourself. You can also go into the app settings and make some adjustments. For example, under here, under the lid close, you can choose whether or not you want it to go into sleep mode or you want to do a quick shutdown. And I personally prefer to do a quick shutdown when I close the device, and so that's what I usually choose. And so those are all the reasons why I think the Anbernic RG34XXSP is nearly a perfect Game Boy Advance. We've got a great screen, we've got excellent buttons, we've got the clamshell form factor, and then finally a variety of software options. But I did say nearly perfect because there are a couple caveats here that prevent it from being like the ultimate Game Boy Advance machine. It's very close, but not quite there. Now, these are definitely nitpicks depending on what you actually care about, but for me, it is worth mentioning. So the first one is the bezels right here. It is off center. If you look at the shell, there is a larger chin on the top than there is on the bottom. So it's a little bit off center, and I wish that it was just perfectly centered right here. It's a very subtle difference, and I've heard a lot of people don't really care about it, but for me personally, it is something that I see every time I open up this device. When you compare it side by side to the Miu Flip, which has the exact same size but a larger screen, I would much rather have preferred something a little bit more centered like on the Miu Flip. My other nitpick has to do with the presence of these analog sticks, just because I feel like it's not a good fit for this as a Game Boy Advance handheld. There may be some Game Boy Advance games where you would prefer to use a left analog stick. For example, something that's a little bit isometric. So, playing like a 3D style game that's still 2D, but, going in diagonal directions might be a little bit easier with a stick than it is the actual D-pad. But other than that, for GBA in particular, I just don't have a need for these analog sticks. And so it just feels a little bit weird that they're there on something that is designed so closely for Game Boy Advance. And so that's what I mean by nearly perfect. There are so many good things about it in terms of the screen and the controls and whatnot, but my spidey senses still tingle every time I use this, where I'm like, the design on this just doesn't make a ton of sense. Now, this device is capable of playing systems other than Game Boy Advance, but like I talked about a lot in my impressions video, I don't think it's well suited for those systems anyway. Let's use Game Boy as our first example. So this is a 10:9 system, which means that it's a little bit squarish in its aspect ratio, and that leaves a lot of wasted space on a wider display like this. This screen is 3:2, and you can see that in the software settings of the stock Anbernic software, they already have these bezels put in there to kind of cover up the black parts of the screen, but you can see that it's kind of weird, like it's bezel within a bezel. Not only does the shell itself have a lot of chunky space here, but now we have it within the screen too. And so even though we have a lot of room to work with, the screen itself is very small. Now, a 4x3 system like the 35XXSP also is going to have black bars on the left and right, but you can see that this size itself is quite a bit bigger just because it's a taller aspect ratio because this one's 4x3. And so if I had to choose which system I wanted to play Game Boy on, I would definitely choose the one on the left more than the one on the right. Now, the issue becomes even more prominent when playing 4x3 content, which is going to be the majority of the other systems that you would play on these handhelds. So here we're playing Sega Genesis, and on the left here you can see that it's a perfect fit with 4x3. On the right side, they have these small bezels on the left and right because the screen itself is wider than 4x3, so they're covering up that black space again. And you can also see the image size is quite a bit smaller on the handheld we're reviewing today. It's only 3.1 inches in diameter diagonally compared to 3.5 on the Anbernic 35XXSP. And there is a bit of a trade-off here, so you can see that this one is actually a lot more colorful and vibrant, and I think that looks awesome. It's also a lot sharper because this is a higher resolution screen. But when it comes to size in general, I think that this screen on the right is just a little bit too small for my older eyes. And one slightly frustrating aspect is that there is space for a 4x3 screen in this shell. After all, the Miyoo Flip has it, and so it almost leaves me wishing that I had this screen on the left on this device on the right. And of course, it's a trade-off because I think that the colors are better on the right, and then also obviously this is going to be much better for GBA on the right as well. Another way to illustrate this point is that, a device like the TrimUI Brick, a much smaller handheld, has a larger 4x3 screen than the 4x3 image that we have on the 34XXSP. So the one on the left is 3.2 inches versus 3.1 here on the right. And so this is what I mean by the fact that when playing 4x3 content, it is a little bit too small for me, just because there are smaller devices that are actually bigger than this one here when showing 4x3 content. So there are many reasons why this Anbernic is a good handheld, but I think playing 4x3 is not one of them. Now, you might also be thinking that, hey, this is a wider aspect ratio, so maybe wide aspect ratio things like, 16:9 content like the PSP will look good on a 3:2 aspect ratio display. And in general, it actually does. 3:2 is a really good aspect ratio to kind of go in between 4:3 and 16:9, but I think that this screen in general is just too small to scale correctly. So in this case, PSP is playing at 3.3 inches, which again for me is just a little bit too small. Now, for some people, this may not bother you at all, but I think that just in general, a larger screen that's 3:2 would be a better all-around fit. So again, my big takeaway is that this is very good for Game Boy Advance, but not quite great for everything else. I would rather not play with 4:3 content or 16:9 on this device specifically. Now, that doesn't take away from the fact that it's really good when it comes to Game Boy Advance, because all that fits nicely. It's just a matter of whether or not you plan on playing other systems on the same handheld, because I think there are other better options out there. Okay, so at this point, we've now established that this is an excellent handheld for Game Boy Advance and not quite as excellent for the other systems. So now let's say that you're sold on the concept of this handheld. You want something that's Game Boy Advance focused and you think the clamshell form factor is great. So I think the other thing worth considering at this point is whether or not another form factor might be a better fit specifically for Game Boy Advance. So this guy on the right is the Anbernic RG34XXS. So it's essentially the same device as the SP but without the SP clamshell. These both have the exact same chipset, same screen, and also are very nostalgic. One's modeled after the original Game Boy Advance, the other one is modeled after the SP. So at that point, it really comes down to form factor and what you prefer. And for me personally, I would definitely go with the clamshell just because it's a lot more convenient. The fact that I can just close it up and, have a really more compact experience. But then also, I don't think that the 34XX is super comfortable. This is one of those things where the Game Boy Advance was really kind of cool at the time for what it was, but in 2025, there are much more comfortable handhelds to use. One other thing worth noting is that even though these are supposed to be the exact same screen, at least according to Anbernic, the SP is a lot brighter than the regular 34XX. I'm not sure if this is a software thing, like something going on with the kernel, but either way, the SP is a lot brighter, both in custom firmware as well as with the stock operating system. So between the two, I definitely prefer the clamshell form factor, but it's really going to be up to you in terms of what you consider to be more nostalgic. Now let's say you are dead set on playing some 4x3 systems like Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis on this device and you don't want to have multiple handhelds. Well, there is one other option worth exploring, and that is playing this in docked mode. This device does have Bluetooth capability, which means you can use an external controller with it, but then also it has mini HDMI for video out. And the nice thing about these software options is that they will scale to the screen. So when you plug it into a TV, it's going to show in 16:9. And it's going to scale the 4x3 content correctly. It looks awesome. And so that's another thing to think about, is that maybe, instead of playing these 4x3 systems in handheld mode, you could play them docked on a bigger screen and still have a very enjoyable experience. Now, before we wrap up, I did want to talk a little bit about charging with this device. Like with the other XX devices, it can be a little bit finicky. Generally, my advice is to use a USB-A to USB-C charging cable, like the one that comes in the box for the device. And so usually you can plug that into any adapter and it's going to be able to plug in and it will charge the device. You'll get a little orange light right here. And so that's probably the most consistent way to charge this device, is to use a USB-A cable. However, most people nowadays just have USB-C to USB-C cables, like those that come with their smartphones. And unfortunately, these usually will not charge. You can see I'm plugging it in here and it is not turning orange. There are a lot of factors at play here, but the number one thing is that yes, most of these modern cables will not work with this device. Now lately I've been reading on Reddit how sometimes it's the cable itself and the communication between the adapter and the device that is causing the issue with these handhelds. And so it turns out that sometimes older cables that are USB-C to USB-C will actually work fine even with a fast charging adapter. So the other day I went through all my cables. I found the oldest ones that I had, and these were about 3 or 4 years old. And the amazing thing here is that even though this is a USB-C to USB-C cable, it does actually charge the device. You can see it is showing an orange light right here. And so the solution is kind of counterintuitive, but the idea is that an older cable doesn't have all the same power delivery options that the modern cables do, and these ones will actually charge one of these devices. So it's a little bit of good news in the fact that if you have some of these old cables laying around, you might be able to charge this device C to C. Now don't get me wrong, I still think Anbernic needs to fix the charging issues that they have on their devices, but it is nice to see that if you have one of those older USB-C to USB-C cables, it might work with your smart charger. Okay, so wrapping things up here, I'm not going to do a likes and dislikes column like I do in many of my reviews because I think it's just a very simple equation today. It all really comes down to how much you love Game Boy Advance. If you want a clamshell form factor handheld that has a 3:2 aspect ratio display that is high resolution and good controls, then this thing is a no-brainer. There are some minor annoyances with it, like the fact that the screen is off-center and the analog sticks don't really serve a purpose with Game Boy Advance specifically, but I think those are easily overlooked if you're looking for something that's around $60, $65 that can play these games super well. And so yes, I do consider this to be a nearly perfect Game Boy Advance handheld, and if you're looking for something in that clamshell form factor, then this one is a very easy recommendation. Now for a more well-rounded system, then I think the current option is probably the Anbernic RG35XXSP. This one has its own detractors, like the fact that it's a little bit thick and it doesn't have analog sticks. I think in a perfect world, Anbernic would come out with a third version of this handheld, which has the screen on the left, but the body on the right. I think that would be an excellent handheld all around. And if Miu fixed the hinge on the flip and also got additional software options, this would be a really good choice too. There's also another one coming from Powkitty called the V90S. I should have that one very soon. So there's going to be some clamshell competition heating up here very quickly. But at the end of the day, I don't think that any of those factors take away from the fact that this is a very good Game Boy Advance handheld. If you love that system, you want to have it in a clamshell, then this one is probably the best handheld you can get right now. And for everybody else, I would say just hang on a bit, because I think that by the end of the year, we're going to have even better options. The perfect clamshell handheld has not been released just yet, but hopefully it's coming someday. Anyway, that's all I have for this video today. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Did you pick up this handheld, or are you thinking about something else? And as always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.